I've been using the FX6 for over a year now, and it's been a dream, but I do feel like there's room for improvement. And with all the chatter about the possible upcoming Mark II of the FX6, I feel like it'd be a good time to discuss what kind of improvements can be made and what we might expect from the FX6 Mark II. But before we do, make sure you drop a like, get subscribed, and click that bell to get notified when we post. All right, on with the show. All right, so first up, these are what I would call realistic changes, so something we can reasonably expect on the next version of the FX6. And first, I would start with a 6K non-open gate sensor. Now, I know I say non-open gate, and people are gonna raise a pitchfork at me, but honestly, in my workflow, I'm not really concerned with open gate, and honestly, neither is Sony, unless it's the Venice, as not even the Burano has open gate full frame, and they kind of have a follow where the market goes, and they apparently feel that open gate's not that important. And honestly, for me, it's not that important. But to maintain what the FX6 has going on, a 6K sensor would be competitive and keep up with the other cameras, and it would enable a 4K Super 35 mode, which I am desperately wanting. The fact that on the FX6, a Super 35 is only relegated to 1080p really sucks, as I would love to be able to just swap between the two on one body and not have to have my FX30 on the side, which, hey, a dedicated Super 35 camera is always nice, but to be able to swap to Super 35 on your main camera is nice as well. And who knows, maybe even with all this, we get a 2K Super 16 mode, which would also be good, as a lot of cameras are incorporating that. And outside of the Burano, I don't even think the Venice, and maybe the FX9, no Sony cameras are incorporating Super 16 modes, which I think they're missing out on that, as it's a versatile thing to use, especially with older broadcast lenses, which the FX9 did. And by the way, in kind of talking about this, that does seem like a kind of FX9 thing. Something that is desperately needed is onboard audio inputs, as on the current iteration of the FX6, your only inputs are the two XLR ports that are on the handle, and if you take off the handle, suddenly you have no audio inputs into the camera. Now, when this camera first came out, the FX9 was still a thing, and that camera had audio inputs on the body. So it made sense in a weird sort of way for the FX6 to be in that middle ground. But now that the FX9 is discontinued, it kind of feels like the next version of this camera needs to have audio inputs on the body. And honestly, I'm going to be honest, in my year of use with the FX6, I have not had a job that has called for me to have to use audio inputs in the body, but I feel like for some users, it is a mission critical thing to have, and to not have to rely on that top handle to have audio inputs in the body would be a lot nicer, as pretty much every other camera that's operating at this level has audio inputs integrated directly into the body. Okay, so this one might be a bit of a reach, but I feel like Sony should integrate EL Zone into the next iteration of the FX6, as they've already done it with the Venice 2, and at time of making this video, they might have integrated it into the Burano. I'm gonna put it right here if they did or didn't, but I feel like they need to, as Sony has made it clear that they're not going to be going with false color, and they have their reasons, but honestly, we need some kind of more robust exposure tool than waveforms or histograms in the camera like this, because if you want to have those things, you have to use an external monitor, and that's not necessarily ideal. So having EL Zone built in would be a lot better. Again, I think because cameras like the Burano and the Venice are Cine Alta cameras, that might be the line in the sand for Sony versus the Alpha FX line. So maybe that might be a bit of a dream, but if it were to happen, that would be very ideal. With this next point, I think it's crazy that the FX6 didn't have this, but it's the idea of a locking E-mount. The FX9 has it, the Burano has it, the Venice has it. So the FX6 is the only cinema, like full-on bigger body cinema camera from Sony that does not have a locking E-mount. So the next iteration of the FX6 needs to have a locking E-mount. Like, it's really bizarre to me that it doesn't have that. So they really need to implement it into the next one. For just, the main thing is the security of putting that lens on the body. Now, this is a bit of a nitpick, as it were, in my year of use with the FX6, but I gotta say, on the next version, or hopefully in a firmware update past this next one that's implementing Big 6 into the FX6, But there needs to be a way to disable the excess of audio channels that this camera generates, as the camera only has 2 audio inputs, yet you can maybe get the stereo output to come up to the other two of the 8 channels, but then when you bring it into post, granted, you're probably syncing with whatever audio you did externally, but the fact that this camera generates 8 audio tracks that cannot be turned off is insane. And it's really annoying if you happen to drag on a clip onto the timeline that has no sync audio, and all of a sudden you've got 8 tracks of audio that you're gonna have to suddenly dip and get rid of, and then it just adds another layer of headache into your editing process. And that is something that needs to get fixed, ideally in a firmware update with the FX6, but if not, it needs to be like baked in day 1 of the FX6 Mark II. All right, now these are what I would kind of call like pipe dream changes, not necessarily something that we can reasonably expect, but it would be cool if we were to get it. And the first thing, granted, this is a big leap, but I would say S-Log4. Now, it would be insane of Sony to introduce S-Log4 on an FX line camera and not something like the Venice, but I think it's time, as S-Log3 and S-Gamma 3 Cine, I feel, are getting a bit long in the tooth. And the reason I say that is because, as a colorist, when you're going through this footage, Sony footage really suffers very quickly from chroma noise. And I don't know if that's a symptom of what's going on with the sensor or what's going on with the color pipeline of S-Log3, but I think that an S-Log4 or some kind of improved color processing on the sensor needs to happen so that these sensors do not suffer from chroma noise so quickly while you're trying to grade. As granted, you know, Sony cameras are really great in low light, but there is a certain point where you're gonna experience chroma noise, and it's so prevalent, unlike any other camera system I've used. Now granted, every camera system is gonna have chroma noise, unless of course we're talking about these Fuji cameras that pre-noise reduced chroma leads to some other issues, but we're not talking about those right now. But I just feel that chroma noise on Sony cameras in general is just, it's a little up there, it's a little extreme. And so I think S-Log4 could be the answer, or some kind of different sensors design could be the answer. But yeah, in general, we need improvement on chroma noise performance in these Sony cameras going forward. Now, this is a little bit of like a, how would I call it? A jealousy kind of thing, in that Blackmagic's design of the Ursa EVF was awesome. And I feel like Sony needs to have an EVF in their cameras that isn't just sticking on the loop onto the little onboard monitor. Like, they need to have an EVF. Now, granted, the Venice has an EVF, but the Murano doesn't have a true EVF, and the FX6 and the FX9 definitely did not have an EVF. So an EVF in this kind of price range would be great, as cameras in this price range are starting to have those things. And I feel like a good first-party one that is integrated well into the system would be very welcome. And I wouldn't even mind if it had some kind of proprietary connection, although what would be really clutch, I don't know if Sony would go for this kind of thing, but like what Blackmagic did, where it connects via a locking secured USB-C connection, that would be fantastic. If they would do something like that, that would be good. That would be very interesting, especially at this price bracket, because the only other thing at this price range that has an EVF is the Pixis, and we're gonna call it that price range, but realistically to get operational, it's gonna cost way more, but the Ursa Cine. So for the FX6 to get these kind of things, take a swipe at those somewhat higher tier cameras would be good for them. All right, so at this point, this is just me spitballing, but I feel like the next iteration of the FX6 needs some kind of internal RAW. Now, at some point, the FX6 has its like RAW panel tab thing, but that's not true RAW. That's not like undebayered sensor data that you really manipulate all the way. It's like, it's not RAW. And I think more importantly though, if we don't get RAW, we need some kind of 12-bit video codec, as I feel like 10-bit, it's very good. 10-bit is very good. But if we had a 12-bit option, that would slam dunk any other camera around it and give it a leg up, as most of these other cameras all have RAW options, but Sony's cameras don't, as the only RAW option for Sony is XOCN, which is limited to the Cine Alta cameras. So they need to have, I don't know, I mean, the Canon cameras have Canon RAW, but then the lower end cameras have Canon RAW Lite. So if the Sony cameras were to introduce an XOCN Lite, something like that, to give them, I guess, a competitive, I guess, even foothold against these other cameras that have RAW options. But barring RAW, if we never get RAW, at least maybe, this is a real shot in the dark here, but if they were to incorporate some kind of ProRes option, right? And I would only really bother with it if it's a 444 or a 4444, and purely just to have a 12-bit option. As XAVCI, it's a great codec, but I feel like ProRes would be better, especially with the 12-bit gradations for color grading, which to me is very important. 10-bit and XAVCI play back very well, it's all good, but I am more concerned with color grading performance, as sometimes there's 10-bit files, especially if you're pushing really, really heavy grades. It's not going to be everyone all the time, but if you're pushing really heavy grades, XAVCI gets a little iffy. And I feel like a 12-bit option would alleviate that kind of problem. Conclusion time. And you know, it's funny, in thinking about everything I've kind of listed here, most of these features would be improved upon passed down features from the FX9, which would only make sense as the FX9 is discontinued. That camera is gone, and it doesn't appear like anything's going to take its place. So that leaves the FX6 Mark II, as it were. And that camera would more than likely, it's definitely going to have a price increase. I can't imagine a world where the FX6 Mark II is not more expensive than what the FX6 is now. But it would take and fill in that gap between what the FX9 was, because basically we had the step. You had the FX6, FX9, Burano, and now it's just FX6, Burano. So the FX6 Mark II, I feel like, would be that new go-between, unless there is an FX9 Mark II happening, but I really doubt that, as at this point it'd be too much segmentation, you know? And especially with the way that the FX6 has dominated the industry. It's the industry darling now. You see it everywhere. It was all over the Olympics. It's everywhere. People ask for the FX6, the FX3, and all these Sony cameras all the time. So I feel like they're going to capitalize and not splinter the market in the same way the FX6 and FX9 did. If you just have one concise package, the FX6 Mark II would be a dominator. And that's just the thing, right? Now, even if they don't implement any of these changes, the next iteration of this camera will dominate the field. But if they were to implement these changes, it would be an undisputed slam dunk. Okay guys, that's going to be doing it for us today. If you like what you saw, make sure you drag a like, get subscribed, and if you agree or have any particular ideas of what you might want to see in the next iteration of the FX6, drop them in the comment section below. Everything that I kind of brought up is what I feel like in my observations of using it for the last year, but I've only used it for a year. There are people who used it for years longer than me that might have different observations. And if that's you, tell me in the comment section below, because I'm curious to know what other people feel should be coming up in the next version of this camera. But I will see you guys in the next one.